Do not claim to be wiser than you are, and do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. Again, a call to be radically countercultural to what we often find in times of war, which is a desire for revenge. And then it goes on and says in the next scripture, which is Romans 12:18 through 21, if it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, and I will repay, says the Lord. In other words, vengeance is God's work, not human work. Paul writes, instead, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not overcome, it should say, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So these are among the core teachings of Christianity, and if you would advance that slide for me again. So again, this idea of loving our enemies is summed up in quite a those passages. There's many more. Then it also talks about peacemaking. In Romans it says, let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual affection. And then from Psalm 133, how good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity. So these are all core passages that remind us as Christians what our call is. If you would advance the next slide, please, Trey. But Christians do have an approach to war. There are traditions that are pacifist within the Christian tradition, but there's also justification for war. It's what we call just war theory. So in jus ad bellum, which is the right to go to war, there's a whole bunch of rules that they have that is sort of saying this should constrain us from going too quickly into war. And so some of these principles, among them are that the cause needs to be just. We need to be able to protect peace, punish evil, battle injustice, and we have the right to go to war for self-defense. It also suggests that not only just cause, but right authority is important. In other words, that the person who's calling you, the government agency or whatever, however your particular country is organized, should be the rightful ruler and should be moral. It's not just about being right, but they should be the moral sovereign. And therefore, they have as the sovereign in the Christian faith, if that person is a person of moral character and has been rightfully installed, however that is, that the concept is that they represent or are an extension of God's will, that God's allowed that person to be in power. This particular phrase trips a lot of people up. Whether you agree with all of these with equal weight or don't agree with any or only agree with one or two, it's really up to you. I'm just explaining to you what the theory is. So, just cause, right authority. The third thing is right intention. In other words, your intention at the end of the day is to promote good and to avoid evil. So the end goal cannot be things like revenge or retribution. It should be around, we're doing this because a greater good will come out of this. And as we know, those are really can be morally ambiguous types of goals to have. I was struck by how sobered I was when I watched Oppenheimer and realized the power of nuclear energy. The harnessing of that was to stop the war. It was justified because a greater good would come because it would stop the war. But it also showed that it wasn't as straightforward as perhaps some, at least I was taught to believe as a young child. There was, so that right intention often has to have checks and balances within any system because of we as Christians often believe that power can corrupt, and corrupted power does not make pure decisions for right and wrong, especially for people. Another concept of just war is proportionality, meaning that there's a probability of success but a probability of success with as little harm as possible. So, for example, the US has a huge nuclear arsenal. We could probably blow away almost any country if we wanted to, but I don't think that we would be able to do that and have a small amount of harm. So the idea is proportionality. First of all, that the war or whatever should be proportional. There's all sorts of rules around this. I'm not going to get into this, but that you're in for example, in dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan during World War II, that was a huge disproportional amount of death for the outcome. And many looking back would say that didn't meet the need of the criteria of proportionality. It was way too many deaths for the outcome. But those are for ethicists and moral people. But when you're going into war, you're supposed to evaluate that. But the most important thing perhaps is that war is always a last resort in just war theory. It's not the first thing you think of, it's the last thing. It means that you've exhausted every form of diplomacy. You have tried to bring peace, and when none of that works and evil is still raging, then you go to war. Some other concepts in here are use in bello, which is the right conduct in war. I'm not going to go into that. This would be another lecture. But this is talking about how do you conduct yourself in war. And we heard about some of that the last 2 weeks when we talked about the Israeli and the Palestinian narratives of what the international community has set up as how you go about this. And that's also true of this last thing about just war theory is use post bellum. It's not supposed to be a just. There's a spelling error. It's supposed to be J-U-S. It means how you deal with the country that you've just been at war. How do you settle and how do you do reconstruction in those places? And again, some of that was in the last 2 lectures. I'm not going to go into that today. So the other approach is just war theory. The other one is pacifism, which is the group of people within the Christian faith that say that violence is incompatible with the Christian faith. And their verses that they tend to quote when they're talking about this is when Jesus is at the Garden of Gethsemane, the night that he's betrayed, he tells his disciples to put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will die by the sword. And so the concept here is that if we engage in war, then it's only going to escalate, and that's how we will also die ourselves. And of course, again, from the Sermon on the Mount, pacifists tend to claim the verses of blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. And we could go into, there's something like 17 different approaches to pacifism that all have varying degrees. So again, I'm up at the 20,000 foot level, making very big generalizations, but if you're interested in this, a Google search will get you on your way. Let's go to the next slide because I want to talk about Islam. If I can get Trey to advance a slide. There we go. Islam means peace. In Islam, that word salam means peace. It's in the very nature of the religious identifier. So let's talk about that and what Islamic peacemaking means. Claire, if you'd advance the next slide for me. So one of the core things about Islam is that they believe that Allah is the source of peace. And Allah is the Arabic name for God. And so Allah is actually the peace. And so it's one of the attributes and one of the names of God. That's how central this is to their understanding. They too, this should sound familiar, all humans are God's creation. They may not add that we're created in the image of God, but the idea that all humanity is created by God and therefore need to be valued and treasured. In Islam, they have a strong value that it's the responsibility of the faithful to preserve life and to cause no harm. It's also part of the Muslim duty to pursue justice and to do good. And among many of their virtues is the idea of forgiveness and reconciliation. In fact, when you look at there are traditional reconciliation processes that they have it's based on the word sul, and it's called sulha, which means reconciliation among family members or among a community that may be in conflict with each other. You'll remember, particularly in Palestine, I talked about how they all lived together in these villages. Do you think they all lived together and sang Kumbaya? No. They're just like every other community. They had their problems, and so part of their historic cultural heritage is a process that they call sulha, which is a reconciliation process where they bring people together and work out peace. It's an extremely important part of their culture and something that they take quite seriously. So within the culture is a desire towards reconciliation, a desire towards peacemaking. And when we're talking about another word, you'll hear the word, I said sulha, musalaha is the reconciliation process among people. So this is a very big part of Arab culture as well as its roots in Islam. So if you would go to the next slide, please. So for them, there is this concept of seeking peace. And in Islamic peacemaking, it starts with inner peace. There's a state of inner harmony that is part of their spirituality that they emphasize. And so, in other words, internal peace, or that peace that you find from the practices of regular prayer, almsgiving, all these things that are part of the Islamic faith are meant to bring you into a state of inner harmony. And then another key piece of this seeking peace is you're supposed to find peace within the community of Islam. In other words, peacemaking has a very strong quality among Muslims to Muslims. In other words, those that are part of your religious community, you're supposed to work towards building harmony there. But then they also have a strong value that is their responsibility to promote peace as a Muslim to their neighbor, whether or not their neighbor is a Muslim or not. It's part of who they are. If you've ever been in this part of the world, you see this lived out in the generous hospitality of the people. Whether or not you are whatever religion you are, whatever nationality you are, whatever age you are, you show up in this culture and you happen to be in the same area as someone else, they will welcome you in. It's that idea of promoting peace and harmony among all people. And I myself have experienced this many times with people who spoke absolutely no English, and all I could squeak out at the time was hello in Arabic. So this is a very big piece of them. So yes, Anwar.
There's one thing you would say just about Muhammad, Prophet of Muslims. One saying that sticks to my mind. It says the relationship between you and the rest of the world, basically, or everyone is either a brother, a sister in faith, or you're equal in humanity.
Okay, so what Anwar, who's a Palestinian Muslim, is reminding me, and I have to say that I defer because you certainly know your faith a lot better than I do. I don't know as inside as out as well as I would like. That we call everyone a brother and sister within the Islamic faith, but everyone is equal, even to people who aren't outside. So this is this quality of harmony, but also of equality. That's a very big part of Islam. And so these are the foundational values that you'll find when we're talking about peacemaking. So let's look at the Quran, and Claire, if you'd advance that slide for me. So I'm just going to give you some quotes from the Quran. Some of these you probably are not as familiar with if you're from a more Christian perspective, and there are, like there are in our scriptures, there would be dozens of examples. I just pulled out a few. So this is a quote. He, being God, is Allah. There is no God except him, the King, the Most Holy, the All-Perfect, the source of serenity, that's the source of peace, that's the Islam part, the watcher of all, the Almighty, the supreme in might, the majestic. Glorified is Allah, far above what they associate with him in worship. So this is a statement that describes the qualities of God, and within, as I said, Allah is peace. This is where the source of serenity is, that's where that title and that concept comes from. If you could advance the next slide. Again, that all are created by God. Surely we, meaning the Godhead, created you, then shaped you, then said to the angels, prostrate before Adam. So they all did, but not Iblis, who refused to prostrate with the others. I'm not sure who that is, but I will find out someday. But the most important thing is, surely we created you, then shaped you. That's talking about all of humanity. Let's go to the next slide. Here again, they're quotes from the Quran. If anyone kills a person, it would be as if he killed the whole people. And if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of the whole people. You'll remember I talked about this both in the Israeli week as well as in the Palestinian week. What happens to one happens to the whole. And we saw that in what we said, rejoice with those who rejoice, but weep with those who weep. In other words, if one person is hurting, we all are hurting. This is a thread that also moves deeply through Islam. The next slide for another couple quotes from the Quran. Therein they will hear no abusive speech, nor any talk of sin, only saying peace, peace. And if you've ever engaged with people of the Muslim faith, this is how they greet each other. Assalamu alaikum, this is how they're saying, peace be upon you, is what they're saying. Peace, peace. And I've discovered from my own taking of Arabic recently, when they say something twice, they're emphasizing it. And they're saying not just, it's not like hello, hello, it's like hello, it's like, oh, like I'm really wishing peace upon you. And then again, another quote from the Quran, if the enemy is inclined towards peace, make peace with him. Doesn't that sound like that passage in that Jesus talks about, if you have a problem with somebody, and go make peace with them before you bring your gift to the altar? Are we seeing connections here of how we have overlaps and common ground all over the place? Then the next one says, believers, be upright, bearers of witness for Allah, and do not let enmity of any people move you to deviate from justice. Act justly, that is nearer to God-fearing, and fear Allah. So again, this tradition of justice is very big, as it is in our tradition, and we'll soon see in the Jewish tradition as well. I have just a few more quotes for you guys I was trying to make every one of those points that I said was a value held by Islam to find a verse in the Quran to support it, just so you could see how they think about this. So, hasten towards forgiveness. Remember I said forgiveness was a virtue that they emphasize. Hasten towards forgiveness from your Lord and a paradise as vast as the heavens and earth, prepared for those mindful of Allah. They are those who donate in prosperity and adversity, control their anger, and pardon others. And Allah loves good doers. So again, this idea of upright and just and doing good for not only those, again, not just those in your religious community, but for all humanity is a part of this. Let's move to the next slide on the Quran, which is hold fast altogether to Allah's cord and do not be divided into sects. You'll remember we talked about it is good for brethren to dwell, or kindred to dwell together in unity. This is another call, hold fast altogether to Allah's cord and do not be divided into sects. And remember Allah's blessing upon you when you were enemies. Then he brought your hearts together, so you became brothers with his blessings, and you were on the brink of a pit of fire from whence he saved you. So in Islam, they acknowledge that there are tensions, and yet it's God that brings them in and back into harmony. And then I think this is my, well, maybe, I think this is my final, yeah, nope, we did that one. So next is, how does the Muslim approaches to war? So we talked about the just war theory, and we talked about pacifism, and Islam has its own approach to war. How many of you have heard the word jihad? And how many of you, when you hear that word, it breaks you shake in terror, right? So first of all, jihad, in the way it's talked about the most in the Quran, is an inter-spiritual struggle to overcome sin. It's talking about the jihad that you have within yourself to correct the behaviors that are in conflict with one another. And actually, there is not as much emphasis as you might imagine, given how we hear this word, on the external understanding of jihad, which can involve two things. One, a debate with other people. In other words, you're in conflict and you're debating, or the physical call to resist non-Muslims in your midst. But the emphasis in Islam is actually jihad is an interstate of spirituality that is meant to bring you, guess where? To peace and harmony within. And the belief within the Islamic faith is that when you are in peace and in obedience to Allah, you will experience that inner peace, and that will free you up to be able to do good and be peacemakers in places like that. And that is far more of the emphasis than this idea of violent jihad. Now, I want to say, just because you're going to go, okay, Debbie, if I look this up on Google, I'm sure I'm going to find all this stuff on jihad and how that's ISIS and every other violent thing. You're right, you're going to find it, because Islam is as diverse as everything that we have in Christianity or in Judaism or in any of the world religions. You are going to find extremists who take any sacred text and narrowly interpret it to weaponize it. Remember at the very beginning I said we need to be careful not to conflate a small group or an extremist group with the whole, and that is also true of Islam. There are, just like there are Christians, I know because I know my congregation, I know there are a few brothers and sisters in Christ who you would prefer not to have to talk to on a regular basis because of what you would call hate speech or elevated or exaggerated speech, right? Or even actions that you would totally disagree with. It's true in Islam. There's not this narrow understanding and only one expression of it. But within the Quran, jihad is actually described as that inner struggle to overcome sin. To overcome sin, to be able to be in harmony with God and within yourself, that leads you to be in peace and harmony with others. If we go to the next page, this might even surprise you that Islam does not allow violence except in the case of 3 exceptions. It's against the Islamic beliefs. These exceptions are if a Muslim is prohibited from practicing their faith, they are able to resist. If they are being oppressed or subjugated, they are allowed to resist. And interestingly, the 3rd exception, and remember when Islam was founded, not in 1948, but 1,500 years ago or more, if land was forcibly taken from them, they are able and allowed to use violence to get it back. Remember how we talked about Palestinians have a deep rootedness to the land? That sense of not land ownership, but of connection to the soil and the earth where you and your relatives have been born and raised and developed is part of a big part of Arab culture, whether it's, and remember, Arab culture predates Islam. So that is just a big piece of this. So these are the only 3 exceptions that you're allowed to use force in Islam. The next page is the range of responses. You can route them out, route your enemy out, or you're called to forgive your oppressor. And again, the next slide includes some quotes from the Quran. It says, and this may be troubling to you, but this is part of their tradition, just like we have violence in our own scriptures. It says, slay them whenever you find them and drive them out of the places from where they drove you out. For persecution is worse than killing. And then again, tell those who disbelieve that if they cease persecution of believers, that which is past will be forgiven them. In other words, for that justification, if they're not allowed to worship, or they're not allowed to, or they're oppressed or subjugated, if they stop the behavior, then the call within the Quran is for forgiveness. Let's go to the next slide. Well, before I do, did any of that surprise some of you? Is that new information for some of you on Islam? And I will readily say that I know much more about Christianity, even more a little less, but I know a lot about Judaism. I know very little about Islam, as do many of us. So I just want to let you know that in January, our discipleship group will be holding a 4-week series on Introduction to Islam. We're collaborating with the Islamic Center here in Cincinnati, and they are bringing speakers in. And so if you're interested in learning more, and I would encourage you to learn more about the significant world religion and our brothers and sisters, not just here, but around the world, it'll be a Wednesday night Zoom class for 3 weeks in person, and then the 4th week, we're actually going to the Islamic Center to observe prayer and see their worship space. So I would just encourage you to put that on your a bookmark and take advantage of a chance to educate yourself from people that are part of this faith and live this faith, and it'll be very, very good. But let's move on to Judaism. So we want to look at peacemaking in Judaism. And what is the greeting that is given to every Jewish person when they meet? Shalom, right? And you know what that means? Peace, right? It means peace. So we have 2 of these religions that within their very names have an indication of peace in them. We Christians have got to find something else. I don't know. Well, Christ is our peace, so we'll just stick with Christ. We'll stick with Christian. Okay. So let's go to the next page on what our next slide on what Jewish peacemaking is. Jewish peacemaking believes also that humans were created in the image of God. This shouldn't surprise you, since the building blocks of Christianity are built on the Jewish faith quite deliberately. So, but within Jewish thought, they talk about that in being created in the image of God, human beings are the masters of the world. That's that word and its comment about dominion. They believe that be created in the image of God is that we as human beings are an extension of God's creative process, and that from those opening verses in Genesis, we are also called as Jewish people who are Jewish, to emulate God in seeking justice and righteousness. So while we have an overlap, we don't tend to emphasize that thing. Not that we would disagree with that as Christians, but we wouldn't tend to say that the doctrine of being created in the image of God means we're supposed to seek justice and righteousness. We would nuance that in a different way. But from a Jewish perspective, this is how they develop that doctrine. Let's move to the next slide, where it says, to take a life is to diminish God in the world. And the idea behind this in Jewish thought is that if you take a life that God has created, that has the image of God, the divine spark living within it, you actually are destroying a piece of God that's meant to be here on earth. They also, of course, have what Jesus also built on, the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. The word shalom means peace. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But they also have a concept that is not part of the Old Testament scriptures, but if you understand Judaism, Judaism is more than just the scriptures. There's a whole body of reflections and commentaries that become sacred to them over time. All of these traditions are in conversation with scripture and with each other and rabbis from different eras. And so one of the concepts that's come out of that is the idea of tikkun olam, which means to repair the world. So part of Jewish faith is that they believe they have a responsibility for repair, where there are places that there's a breach of God's intention for the world. It's their job and their responsibility to bring, to fix that or to repair it. They also have this concept of pikawach nefesh, which is the preservation of human life. And so high is this value that it says within the Talmud, some of the other commentaries on Scripture, that this concept of preserving life actually supersedes many of the other Jewish laws. You know, there's 613 in the Old Testament. There's many, many laws or expressions of those laws that have been developed over time. But the idea, if someone is in real danger and their life is at risk, it is a job of a Jewish person to preserve their soul. That this word in Hebrew means saving the soul, saving a life, and it really virtually overrides every other rule in Judaism. So that means if you were to break the Sabbath, you would be considered unclean, or all the Jewish rules that sometimes we read about in the New Testament. If it meant that a person would die if you did not break that law to help them, you would be considered out of compliance with the core values of Judaism. Let's go to the next page. And so this is a quote from the chief rabbi who actually formulated the purity of arms statement for the Israeli Defense Forces. And he says, human life is undoubtedly a supreme value in Judaism. And this refers not only to Jews, but to all men created in the image of God. This is a very core understanding of Jewish peacemaking. Let's go on, and I'm just going to read a bunch of texts. Some of these will be more familiar to our Christian audience. God said, let us make humans in our image according to our likeness. We quoted that earlier. But then also from Psalm 8, where the psalmist says, what are human beings that you're mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. The next page, again, these may seem very familiar to some of you. We use these a lot in our own Christian faith. From Isaiah, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Of course, I don't think it needs to go, I don't need to say this, but I'll say it anyway. We do remember that Jesus was a first century Palestinian Jewish man who was schooled in the Torah and in the Jewish faith. And as he is the expression of the messianic hope of that faith, he of course tied our faith to the Jewish faith with his own commentary and his own, as a rabbi, which is part of their tradition, bringing his own commentary to these scriptures. So here is to the point of you shouldn't, that to diminish a human life is to diminish the image of God. This is from Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image, God made humans. In other words, if you snuff out the divine spark by killing someone, you should also die because you have snuffed out the divine image. Also, of course, love your neighbor as yourself, which is rooted in the great laws of the Old Testament. The next one is to seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. This is from Jeremiah 29. And pray to the Lord on its behalf. Pray for the city where you are under exile. You're the oppressed people in this story. Pray for the welfare of your oppressors, for it's in its welfare that you will find your welfare. Or, in other words, saying, if you pray for the well-being of your enemy, you will find your own well-being. When you say seek the welfare of the city, many people in the text will say, but seek the shalom, the peace of the city, wherever you have been sent to exile. And then again, loving your neighbor as yourself. I guess I put that in there twice. Let's do the next page. This is from a prayer where it says, let the time not be distant, O God, when all shall turn to you in love, when all the brokenness in our world is repaired by the work of our hands and our hearts, inspired by your words of Torah. So again, this is the Tikkun Olam, the idea that we are responsible, we seek God to bring healing to the brokenness in the world. So let's look at the next slide and look at the Jewish approaches to war. So within the Jewish tradition, they do allow for war, and they have a series of standards that they use to justify war. We talked about the Christian just war theory. We talked about Islam and its 3 exceptions, and now we're going to talk about Judaism and what's the basis for them allowing war. First of all, they say that you must seek peace first and avoid war at all costs. If war does happen, you're supposed to preserve the ecological needs of the environment. That means for your enemy as well. There's statements that they take very seriously about you shouldn't destroy water supply or the infrastructure of your enemy because it has an environmental or an ecological impact, not only for you, but for your enemy. And you're supposed to be able to look beyond the war to see that you need to preserve something for people to be able to survive. It also says that when you do wage war, you have to maintain a sensitivity to human life. In other words, again, that idea that that every human life has value, and to diminish it or to snuff it out is to snuff out the divine life, and that the goal of any war or conflict is peace. And then let's talk a little bit about a little more detail. On this slide is a form of war. They have two different theories. I'm not going to go into the second one, but this is the one that really applies to us. That war in Judaism can be commanded by Torah. So you'll know the conquest of Joshua, which makes many people uncomfortable, but way back in the day. But then there's also a scripture in there that talks about the Amalekites, and they snuck up on the Israelites, and they killed their babies and their women. And out of that, there's a scripture that says they'll conduct war against the Amalekites forever. In this particular conflict, that verse has been called up to say what Hamas did, they are really the Amalekites, therefore our war is commanded in scripture. However, just so you know, in most of the literature, the rabbis that have been, for centuries, have said that the Amalekite rule no longer applies, but that's another story. Or that you can, if you're commanded by Torah, to conduct war in situations of defense. They also believe that they are entitled to wage war if it protects the survival of the Jewish people. That means their physical and or their spiritual survival. They have a rule that says everyone must fight, and there are some exceptions in the Bible, such as if you've just gotten married or just had a child or something. And you see this in modern Israeli thought, which is why men and women serve in the IDF. Everyone is called to defend the Jewish people. And also they're supposed to fight if the king or president or general calls forth war. They need to answer the call and go to war. There are nuances to all of this, but just to say this is the Jewish approach to war. On the next slide, you'll also see that we have an approach to nonviolence, also within Judaism. And so they would say it's not pacifist, but they would say to restrict the use of violence because it's the way to fulfill truth and justice and peace. And you cannot do that if you're engaging in violent behavior. So there is a nonviolent tradition within Judaism, but it's not like the pacifist traditions of like the Mennonites or the Quakers that we have in Protestant Christianity. And again, this is from the Psalms, depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. And then our last scripture for the Old Testament is the great priestly benediction, often said in Christian churches as well as very important within Judaism. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So let's go to the next slide, and I want to just talk about what in the heck, we've been talking about peace for the last hour or so. You may be wondering, what the heck does peace even mean? And in peace studies, there's two different kinds of peace. And the reason this is important is because you'll hear people throw around the word for peace and they mean different things by it. And of course, within these two definitions, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of pages that have been written to nuance these. But in just general terms, negative peace means the absence of violence. In other words, no war. So when people right now are calling for a ceasefire, it's negative peace, right? That's what they would call it. There's an absence of war and conflict. Usually that's negotiated at some level, and it means we've agreed to disengage, and that will hold until we get mad at each other again and we start fighting again, all right? So negative peace does not look at any of the underlying causes of why they were at war. It just says it has to stop. Now you can imagine that for the second one, which is positive peace, that's the presence of positive relationships that affirm one another's dignity. That sort of qualitative sense of peace, or where people can thrive side by side with each other, this is what in our faith as Christians we would believe would be the goal, right? Where people are thriving, recognizing each other's common humanity. In fact, we see a thread for positive peace through Islam as well as into Judaism. But you usually can't work on positive peace until you have a cessation of violence going on. So that's sort of the two big categories. So if we go to the next slide, this, I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is some of in the realm of positive peace, they would say things like, you should have a sound business environment, in other words, where people can economically thrive. There should be a well-functioning government. There should be equitable distribution of resources. There should be a free flow of information going. There should be good relationships with your neighbors, not just with people who think like you or believe like you. There should be high levels of human investment in the society. There should be an acceptance or an acknowledgement or an enforcement of good, positive human rights for all. And there should be low levels of corruption. So when they kind of talk about positive peace, and again, there are thousands and thousands of pages written about this, what they actually mean by that, it's in this kind of cluster of well-being, society functioning well, people within that society being able to thrive. There's equity, there's justice, there's opportunity. All of this would be what they would consider positive peace. So if you're in a situation where you're at war with someone, say on an international level, the idea would be to first stop the violence and then to have some sort of process, which is often more complicated and more difficult when you've had conflicted people, to move towards goals of creating a positive environment where all people, even those who have been enemies, are able to thrive next to each other. And within the Christian community of peace, at first, it's like, before we even get talking about positive peace, we've got to stop the violence. But then they would say that our emphasis is not just stopping it, it's actually developing a society that thrives next to each other. But you would also find that same quality in Islam. Remember, Anwar just reminded us about peacemaking. You have peace with your brothers, but that you also have equality and equity with those who are not Muslims. And so in that, they would also probably have a very well-developed sense of positive peace. In Judaism as well, there's a sense of it's not just enough to cease violence towards one another, but that we would want opportunities within our society for people to be able to thrive. We'll talk about the very end, but if you were to go to the human rights organizations that are represented by religious groups, they're all going to talk to you about human rights and positive peace. They're going to talk about the first and say that just has to stop. But whether it's Islamic or it's Judaism or Christian, are all going to have commitments and programs or criticisms or critiques or be advocates or be protesting for the basic humanity of every human being on the planet. And they're going to advocate that all people should be treated with dignity and respect. That may look a little different in different parts of the world, depending on the culture, but these are going to be the types of commitments you're going to see across the board in all peacemaking. You can even see this in secular human rights organizations and peacemaking organizations. You don't need to be religious to believe in positive peace. You don't need to be religious to agree that violence is a bad thing. So this is not only a common ground that we build with people from other religions, it's the common ground and the common good that we find with all people. Because don't all of us, whether you're Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, whatever you are, don't you want to raise your children in peace? Don't you want to be able to thrive? Don't you want to be able to move within a society without being worried about being discriminated against or assaulted violently, whether verbally or physically? Of course, that's it. So let's move to the next slide and talk about what does peacemaking look like in our everyday lives. There's a tradition within all three of the major religions that peacemaking starts within. So I started with the idea of lowering the temperature on the rhetoric. It doesn't mean we can't act in a more public way, but we need to make sure that there's consistency or integration between what we're saying and how we're doing on the inside. So this integrity, the word hypocrisy means two-faced, right? You're saying one thing and doing another. Hypocrisy could also mean believing one thing and saying another or doing another. So the first thing in our everyday lives is we want to make sure we're listening. And to that, I just want to thank all of you. You've taken 6 hours of your life by listening to a lecture last week and one this week and today, because you wanted to listen to perspective that you may not have understood. You wanted to be able to meet and interact with people or hear stories about people that are not like you. That's the first step, listening and trying to understand the perspective of another. It's also important in peacemaking in our everyday lives that we include others who've been excluded from our conversations. Sometimes it's really easy for us to get in our echo chambers, but we don't even realize that when we do that, we've excluded a whole group of people. And part of peacemaking is to intentionally include people in the conversation. I'll give you an example of that. For me, I started a small group way back when I was still in seminary with a group of women in Berkeley, California. And we got together and we all realized when we looked at the group that all of us were from the same socioeconomic class and all of us were white. And then we sat and looked and thought, who are we excluding by our group? And so then the group said, who do we need to include that's from a different education level, socioeconomic class? Who are we missing the voices of people who are, that come from other cultures? And it was an intentional part to include the people that have been excluded so that our wisdom was a shared wisdom among a broader group of people. And that happens in all sorts of different ways. Then the other thing about peacemaking in our everyday lives is it just requires good Lord, it requires a lot of creative thinking and creative action. Doing the same thing over and over again does not get you anywhere new. And so sometimes people who are really involved in peacemaking within their own family systems or workplaces have to think creatively and outside the box. You have to be willing to experiment and try new things. You have to be able to read and hear what other people have worked, but not think that just because it worked for that family over there, it's going to work for us. But if you're committed to peace in your family life or your work life, your community life, or even on the international level, it's not always, there's only A or B alternative. There's probably C, D, E, F if we're open to it. So the idea of being creative in that, and again, one of the ways we get creative, if you listened and included to other people that have not often been the same voices that you've always heard, it's amazing how creative energy can be done. So I want to go to the very last part of this talk, and that is, I want to talk about the Palestinian Christians specifically in this part of the world. I said at the beginning, I come from a Christian perspective, and while I included some of the ideas of Judaism and Islam in this talk, and I hope you found it helpful, there's one voice that has been often excluded in the Christian conversation as well as the United States. We've marginalized the Christian Palestinians who live in this land. And so I want to just give you just a few little hints from some of the ways that they look at this conflict. They are a minority within a minority in this land. As they are, a Palestinian means that they're Arabs. Palestinian means that's their ethnic. Some Palestinian Christians could be Israeli citizens. The majority are not. They are living in the West Bank with a very small number in Gaza. When you think about Gaza having 2.3 million people, there are less than 1,000 Christians in Gaza. But there is a church in Gaza that was built in the 424 CE. It's a Greek Orthodox church. You may have read a few weeks ago that it was bombed in Gaza. And the Christians there want to stay there to continue their witness there. So there are Palestinian Christians all throughout the West Bank and all throughout the Middle East. And so one of the great rallying cries that they take as a place is they want to be just like Christians, like we are. They want to follow Christ and follow Christ's teaching there. But as Arab Palestinian Christians, they are a very, very small minority in that part. So they take this verse from Micah quite seriously, as do many Christians, as do Jewish people as well. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. They also believe strongly that Jesus taught them to bring good news to the poor, proclaim the release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. And so what we see in Christian peacemaking in this part of the world is a desire to follow Christ, and the next slide is a repeat of that slide from Ephesians I gave you at the beginning about Christ being our peace and breaking down the walls of hostility. But if you go to the next slide, Claire, they really see justice as a piece of peacemaking that often gets neglected. There's many types of justice, but there's two big categories. One is punitive justice, which is the imposition of punishment when something has gone wrong or somebody has done something. You're imposing that punishment on the offender. Now, in this part of the world, punishment can be collective or individual. In the United States, we tend to, when we're thinking about our justice system and our court system, we're talking about individuals that are brought to account who may be punished for their behavior. Although in all of the talk about racism in America, we also know that there's systemic injustice that happens when groups of people, I'm not going to get into that right now, but for our cases, I'm talking about that punitive justice. But in this part of the world, there is collective justice where somebody in a court system in Israel, for example, will say that because one person in the family did something wrong, the whole entire family may be deported or maybe lose their citizenship, or what is more common, their home is demolished. That's what we call collective punishment. Even those who weren't a part of the crime, because of their relationship to the person who did, they are also punished. So in this part of the world, they're also saying punitive justice includes that imposition of punishment on the offender, but in this part of the world, it can also sometimes mean to the individual or to a collective group of people. Does that make sense? All right. The other type of justice that they are far more concerned about this in the Christian, Palestinian Christian world, is what they would call restorative justice. And this is a justice that seeks to compensate the victim, repair the harm, and restore the relationship. Doesn't this sound a little bit like positive peace? Again, it has that quality. So even in the idea I talked about, the Arab concept of sulha, of reconciliation with families, this is what they tend to do. In other words, how do you make repair? How do you make it right? How do you restore the relationship? So when communities, like I said, these villages would have families that would come together, there might be a fight going on between two families, the heads of the families would come together and talk about what happened, and then they would agree on if there's compensation or what someone might be due to prepare, but the goal is to restore the relationship. The goal is different than punishing someone for a wrong. It's about restoration. And the Christians, this is not unique to Christians by any means, but in Palestinians, Christians in this part of the world, this is their emphasis is on restorative justice and what they will call within their communities. If you can advance the slide, this is a quote from Pope John Paul II. The largest group of Christians in the Middle East are Greek Orthodox Christians, something we don't really have a lot here. The second largest group are Catholics. And so the words of the Pope mean a lot in this part of the world. And Pope John Paul II said, "There is no peace without justice." So you cannot have peace unless justice is alongside of it. In other words, justice is the righting of relationships, righting a power imbalance. Again, positive peace, all people thriving, having equal rights, human rights. Okay? And there's no justice without forgiveness. So it's not just enough from the Christian point of view to say, okay, we want to advocate for justice, but there has to be something about forgiving our enemy, which actually enables us to have reconciliation, going back to restorative justice. So let's go to the next slide. So justice, though, eases the path to forgiveness. How many of you have ever been wronged by somebody? All of us have. I know you can all raise your hands on that one. And when someone makes it right or acknowledges that they were wrong, does that make it a little easier to forgive them? Isn't it hard to forgive somebody when they won't acknowledge that they did anything wrong, or nobody will own that what they did was unjust, unfair? When somebody who's betrayed you won't acknowledge it, isn't it a lot more easy than going back to Shakespeare to deliciously sort of live in that place of wishing them harm? So justice eases the path towards forgiveness, and the Palestinian Christians believe this strongly. They are advocates for ending the occupation. Until the occupation can end, while they would still call their brothers and sisters in Christ to forgiveness, they will say it will be awfully difficult as people are still suffering. So justice comes before forgiveness. But remember, competing narratives define justice differently. So another place of listening, maybe if you're involved in conflict, is what would justice look like to you? Because it may not look like justice for what it means to me, but you may have a different definition of justice. So in every competing sets of narratives, and anytime there's conflict, there's usually a competing narrative, it's important to find out what would justice, what would restoration, what would healing, what would forgiveness, what would reconciliation look like? And they believe that insisting on punitive justice will not bring about relational reconciliation. It will just keep exacerbating the separation that they feel. So the Palestinian Christian perspective is very strong on this restorative justice towards positive peace, and that justice first will ease the path towards forgiveness, which will lead the path towards reconciliation. Which here I have it again. The next slide. Forgiveness eases the path to reconciliation. And so can you have forgiveness without justice? You can. But in that case, it may not lead to any change. And it also diminishes the experience of the sufferer. We all know that in our own lives, in the Christian tradition, often the person that's been victimized is called to forgive way too fast. Or you're the one who has to forgive, and no one talks to the perpetrator and says, you need to own up to what you did, right? There's a tendency to put the weight on the victim and not on the perpetrator. And that's what this means. Diminishes the experience of the sufferer when you call for forgiveness without justice. So these are these things that have to be held in tension. Christian Palestinians are trying to work on this. They are advocates. There's many, many documents I could share with you in another 2-hour talk if you wanted it, on some of they are strong advocates that the occupation has to end, and in that a call for that life together with Israelis and Palestinians, whether they have separate states or one state, that's not what they're talking about, is that they have to find a way to love and reconcile it with each other. That's the end goal. Whether they're living separately or, with a national border between them or not, that this is a part of how they see, again, going back to the idea of common humanity. So on the next slide, I'm going to read a quote from Pope Francis. As I said, he's very significant. His voice is significant in this part of the world. Justice properly sought solely out of love of justice itself, out of respect for the victims, as a means of preventing new crimes and protecting the common good, but not as an outlet for personal anger. Justice is properly sought under those conditions. Forgiveness is precisely what enables us to pursue justice without falling into the spiral of revenge or the injustice of forgetting. And that term there, the injustice of forgetting, is a phrase that could apply to the Jews, never again. It could apply to the Palestinians in this conflict. There would be an injustice in forgetting. And so the idea of true reconciliation has to involve owning up to what the true challenges and wrongs that have been done. That justice and repair and reparations are part of this, and in that there can be forgiveness and true reconciliation. If we go to the next slide, I just want to talk just briefly about what the options are for just peacemaking in Israel-Palestine. I don't know where all of you are, so I decided I was not going to impose my view of what I thought peacemaking should look like, because I think all of us have to figure out what that is. And knowing the number of people online, I have no idea where all of you are from or what your perspectives are. So what I want to encourage you is to stay informed and share the wisdom. If you have wisdom or insight, then share it within the groups of people that you have influence. But it's important that you at least have accurate information, I hope. But I want to encourage you to be careful not to impose on others what is not yours to decide. Every single group I have ever taken over to Israel-Palestine, after about the second day, most of the Americans in the group start telling me what their peace plan is. They're just convinced that they can solve the problem after the second day, if only they would. And then I'm usually like, well, why don't you just ask our Palestinian guide, or if you meet an Israeli, ask them what they think and listen. And then by about middle 2/3 of the trip, they're like, I don't think that idea is going to work. It sounds really complicated. But we would be guilty of being colonialists if we impose on this region what we think is the right answer to everybody. When you talk to Israelis and you talk to Palestinians, most of them will, if you ask them, and they're happy to tell you if you ask them, have ideas about what they think should happen. And that listening and staying informed needs to begin with their perspective. It's not ours to decide. Now, we do have a stake in the game. We give $3 billion on a regular basis and an additional $14 billion that we just gave for military aid. So we have a right to decide on how our American tax dollars are being spent. But what peace looks like in that region, we need to hear from the folks that are there and then become partners with them for what they want. It's not ours to decide. And I will tell you, I'm guilty of this. I have spent many hours talking to people in this region and trying to convince them that my way is absolutely the best way, only way, and right way, only to be schooled and found out that I didn't even have an ounce of wisdom for the situation. So I have learned to listen. That doesn't mean I don't do anything, but it means I respond and react and have grown and learned from the people who are there. As an example of just in this, the people that are here in the church, Anwar is a Palestinian. He was born in Palestine. His home is in the shadow of a Palestinian or Israeli settlement. Anwar knows this situation inside and out. If you want to have a perspective, don't trust me, talk to Anwar. Now, Anwar doesn't represent every single Palestinian that ever existed, and I don't think you want to be representative of all the Palestinians, but it is important to hear what his perspective is, what peace looks like for him. And as a person of faith, but it's not a Christian, but as a Muslim, he may have different approaches. This can build the wisdom that we need and to be supporters of in partnership with People for Peace. The other thing I just want to encourage you to do is Google human rights organizations. There were like 55 Israeli human rights organizations last week that called for a ceasefire. They're wonderful organizations. You can pick and choose whichever one fits sort of where you are or has a narrative that you agree with. But there are also religious peacemaking organizations, including the Presbyterian Church. We have our own versions of this. Google them and learn about them. Listen to what their narrative is, what they're trying to do. Are they people that have decided we know all and we're going to impose it on the world? Are they a group of people that are listening to the wisdom of people on the ground? Who are their leaders on the ground? Are they a bunch of Americans that they've just imported over there? Or are they using people within the culture itself who are part of their peacemaking process? You can find human rights organizations, the very big ones, and you can find little teeny tiny ones. I would just encourage you to do that. And I can make a recommendation for you, but I really think, not knowing where all of you are, this is a piece that you can get more involved by being engaged. That also would involve engaging if you want to engage politically or not. And again, starting with human rights organizations is a really good place to start. On the next page, if you want to do further study, these lectures, as you know, are on the YouTube for our church, Mount Washington Presbyterian Church. You just go to the live, or there's also now a classes section that has these. All these PowerPoints will be linked in those descriptions. And I'm hoping, I have a bibliography, I have a 2-page bibliography, but I need to update it. I just want to review it again. I didn't have a chance to do that before today, but I'll link that also in the descriptions here in case you're interested in reading. There's tons of books that you can read from all sorts of different perspectives. There's movies you can watch. There's novels you can read that'll put you into this whole piece of this, but I'll post it. You can read whatever you want. I will say that the church, Mount Washington Presbyterian Church, next January will be selling books called The Lemon Tree, which is by Sandy Tolan, an NPR reporter who wrote, the book is called The Lemon Tree, a Jew and Arab in the heart of the Middle East. And in his approach, what he tells is the story of one home in Ramla, or Al-Ramla, depending upon which part of the narrative you're in. One family where the Arab family was forced to flee in 1948, and a Jewish family that moved into that same home. In 1967, because the borders were opened up, one of the sons that was born in that home crossed the border and went to this home and knocked on the door and met the Jewish 19-year-old college student who was living there with her parents. They form a friendship. What Sandy Tolan does is tells the story of the Israeli perspective of Dahlia, and tells her story, and then he tells the story of Bashir, the Palestinian, and how these two stories sort of end up in this, related to this one home. And so the church will be selling those books in January, with the idea that we'll be sponsoring reading book groups on that book in late February and early March, as a way for people to read a little bit more. I have found the book, most people think it's fairly, it's fair in terms of presenting both narratives, although I know Jewish Israelis who think it's too pro-Palestinian. I know Palestinians who think it's too pro-Israeli, which to me is a really good thing. It means they're trying to tell the narratives. They feel like, well, they emphasize too much on the other side. But Sandy Tolan, it's a really good book, and we've used it for years. So anyway, that's just an idea for further study. I also want to encourage you, like I said, Anwar's here. He's been here all 3 weeks, and I'm so delighted. I would call you my brother, even if I'm not Muslim. You are my brother, Anwar. We are friends. And Anwar actually became involved with this whole series because he listened to a lecture I did 3 years ago. And I love getting to know Anwar, and I would encourage you to do the same. The same would be true if you have Israelis in your life. Get to know them and hear their stories. And don't listen to argue with them, just listen. And then go, wow, that's interesting. I heard a lecture about that. What about this part of that? Maybe they agree with it, maybe they don't, but take the time to listen. And then the last thing I want to say is, if you've ever wanted to go to the Holy Land, I lead pilgrimages on a regular basis. Not this week, not this month. I don't think we're going over there. But if you're interested, one of the things that Palestinian Christians love to say is, come and see for yourself. Come and see. And I do have a trip scheduled for April of 2024, but who knows if we're going to be able to go. But if for some reason you are interested in, this is more of a Christian spiritual pilgrimage, although part of it is that you'll become aware of the conflict in different ways, I would be delighted to welcome you or talk to you more about that. Again, just email me about the details of that. I lead them every few years. And now I'm going to end with just one story. This next page. This is one of my favorite stories. This is a baptism at a Lutheran church in Bethlehem in the West Bank. This was this was 10 years ago, actually. And this is Ashraf Chanus. He was a brand new ordained pastor. And I was fascinated as I attended this church. The church worships in Arabic, so I could only observe what was happening. But usually at coffee hour, I could find somebody who spoke English who would explain the whole thing to me. So in the Arab tradition, it's interesting. They have sort of the same idea when Mary brought Jesus into the temple to be dedicated. They have the same thing in Arab culture in the churches, that the mothers and the spouse, the woman sort of isolates in the first 30, 40 days when the baby is first born, but at the 40-day mark, or somewhere around then, they bring the baby in with big pomp and circumstance into the church. In fact, in some of the Catholic churches and some of the people I know, it looks like Easter. The women are wearing white, all the families come in. It's like a huge celebration when this newborn baby at day 40-ish is brought into the church. And Ashraf, just like many of the other priests there, blesses this baby and baptizes this baby at the 40-day mark. In the Catholic tradition, they lift the baby up on the altar as an offering to God, saying this baby is dedicated. It's the most amazing sort of family-oriented sense of celebrating this child. But what surprised me was that at coffee hour after this time, and Claire, if you'd show the next picture, here is this little baby who was passed around from one mother to another. Of the 60, 70 people that in this church, this baby just got passed around because the community really believes that they will raise this child. And one of the things that they want to give this child is an identity as a Christian, that they are born into a community of love, not just their family, but to this whole community. And all of them take responsibility in wanting to nurture, whether it's a little boy or a little girl, this little person is meant to know that they were created and crafted in the image of God. It was one of the most moving things I have ever experienced in church, partly because I didn't understand it, but when I saw the way the community and their sense of commitment to raising this child as a Christian, and remember, in this part of the world, you don't convert to Christianity, you are born into Christianity. They take this so seriously so that this child really will know that they are the beloved of God. But the other thing that I found interesting is that in every baby book that I have ever seen, it's not just the picture of the family at the baptismal font with the pastor like the one I just showed you, but it is pages and pages of the community celebrating the life of this child. When we talk about peacemaking, it's for children like this that it matters to me. It matters to me for the nearly 4,000 children who have died in Gaza, beloved, innocent. It's for the smattering of children that died in the Israeli attack by Hamas, beloved, created in the image of God. And when I think about peacemaking, I think about this little young boy who now would be 10 years old, riding his bike and playing on PlayStation and who knows what he's doing. But my prayer for peace is that he would actually know peace and would be able to, as he looks to his future, not to see an enemy and a wall that he can't cross or a life that he can't have. But I would pray for him and for other children like him that we are creating a world where all are able to thrive, where all are able to reach their potential, where it's not in doubt whether or not they're treated like human beings and given rights and resources to be able to thrive. And so that is my commitment, and I know it's the commitment of many in that part of the world, whether they're Jewish, whether they're Muslim, and I know it is the commitment of the people who are Christian. So thank you again for this, the opportunity to share my thoughts with you tonight. And again, if you have any questions or anything you want to talk to me about, you can find me at Mount Washington Presbyterian Church. Just email me or text me, and I'd be glad to respond. Anyway, thank you and good night.